And there's a part of the book that I actually had highlighted in the introduction, where she says, most citizens who rail against the undocumented insist that their opposition is based solely on technical, legal grounds. They oppose people who broke the law, but becoming undocumented is a highly racialized crime. Nationality itself has its origins in racial thinking and still bases itself on birth and origin in ways that echo racialism. The categories, quote unquote, Mexican and quote unquote Latino have been racialized in the United States, and the category of illegality is heavily associated with the category, quote, Mexican, whether this is understood as a nationality, an ethnicity, or race. In 2011, 93% of federal immigration crimes were committed by non-citizens, and 89.3% of them were committed by Hispanics. Another way to look at the racialized nature of undocumentedness is to compare the criminalization of immigrants, especially Latino immigrants, in the post-civil rights era with the criminalization of blacks.
Oh, listening to you read that passage makes me think about, I wrote that in 2012, 2013. That book was published in 2014. It makes me think about what has stayed the same and what has changed since I wrote it. I think that during the Obama era and previous eras, Bush, Clinton, there was a much bigger attempt to draw this hard and bright line between legal and illegal immigration. And under Trump, at least from the administration, we're hearing a lot more simple anti-immigrant rhetoric, that all immigrants are being criminalized rather than just undocumented immigrants. So I think there's been a kind of a shift in official rhetoric about immigration. Obama and Bush and Clinton emphasized much more that this is a country of immigrants, but then there's just a few bad guys, the criminals, the illegal immigrants. Whereas Trump doesn't really care about the immigrant narrative and that kind of multicultural narrative that was being promoted. And not just by Democrats, because George Bush also had a much more pro-immigrant stance. So illegalizing much more immigration. Another thing that I think has changed since I wrote that is that I think immigration now is becoming much more associated with Central Americans and not just Mexicans. Although I do note that despite Trump's anti-immigrant rhetoric and his recent policies against guest workers, he's still allowing Mexican agricultural workers to come into the country because the agricultural industry is going to collapse without Mexican migrant workers. So, but shifting everything into the guest worker program is just another way of making immigrants more exploitable. Because the guest worker program ties immigrants to employers in ways that make them extremely vulnerable to any kind of mistreatment by their employer, because they can immediately be deported if they raise their voices about anything. But that's mostly going on under the radar, and publicly and officially, I think we're seeing, first of all, the numbers of Mexicans have gone down, the numbers of Central Americans have gone up, but I think in the public eye, that association that I made of undocumented immigration with Mexicans has shifted to Central Americans. But just one other thing I wanted to say about past and present, and this is in response to the comment you made. Trump did not begin this wall.
Yeah.
The wall has been an ongoing project through many administrations. And the emphasis on building the wall really goes back to the early 1990s. So yes, we need to blame Trump for what Trump is doing, but let's not let previous administrations off the hook. That is, Trump is sort of an extreme at least in his rhetoric and in his policies, I guess, an extreme version of what we've been seeing all along. It's not like he invented this. He is building on foundations that were built by his predecessors.
To hear the rest of this show and more, you can find us at This Is Revolution Podcast, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, SoundCloud, Podbean, or wherever else you get your podcasts. This is Revolution. Oh, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.